France has joined a string of other Western countries in recognizing a Palestinian state in recent days. French President Emmanuel Macron made the announcement at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. France and others are backing Palestinian statehood in the hope that a two-state solution will bring an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Recognition by Australia, Britain, Canada, and Portugal on Sunday adds to the pressure on Israel over the war in Gaza. Macron told the UN General Assembly that the time for peace has come.
We must all act to preserve the very possibility of a two-state solution. Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. The time has come. That is why, faithful to my country's historic commitment to the Middle East, to peace between the Israeli and Palestinian people, today I declare that France recognizes the State of Palestine.
I'm now joined by Michael Lynk. He's the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory and current Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Law of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron, for having me.
So what do you think about France recognizing a Palestinian state? Macron said it was the best chance for peace. What's your take?
Well, at the diplomatic level, this is very significant. Let's remember that France is one of the 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council. Let's also remember that France is one of the G7. So in the G7, we also have the United Kingdom and Canada. 3 of the 7 countries in the G7 recognize Palestine as a state. And now 4 of the 5 members of the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council, recognize Palestine as a state as well. So this, I think, is going to have diplomatic ripples, and it was probably France's initiative that is imposing, the pressure on other countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Australia, to also take the same moves as well.
Now, the list of countries recognizing Palestine as a state is growing by the day, but 2 countries not following suit are the United States and Germany. Would their support make a difference for Israel?
Well, of course it would. It's interesting that neither Germany nor the United States are contemplating the recognition of Palestine as a state. They are the 2 largest, by far, suppliers of weaponry to Israel. The United States supplies approximately 70% of weapons to Israel. Germany is around 28%. The rest of the world actually is quite insignificant on top of that. If there was a significant policy change, particularly coming from Germany, which would mean recognition of the state, ending of its weapon sales, and perhaps supporting initiatives within the European Union to suspend free trade agreements and associational agreements with Israel, that would have a significant impact, I think, in raising the costs on Israel, because I don't see any other way for Israel to wind up changing its present direction, its present destructive direction, unless and until these kinds of meaningful sanctions are placed upon Israel by the global North.
Now, and to your point, Israel's ambassador didn't mince words when he addressed the recognition of Palestine in many of these countries. Now, he called the meeting at the UN a theater and a charade and boycotted the meeting. Now, Israel is, of course, continuing a major offensive in Gaza. Now, the question is, can the recognition of Palestinian statehood change the situation on the ground for the Palestinian people in Gaza?
I think the answer is no. Yes, a recognition of a Palestinian state is important coming from members of the global North. It actually places legal obligations on them to recognize Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and to take affirmative steps if that sovereignty is interfered with by another country, i.e., Israel's unlawful occupation. But on another level, it's not likely to change any of the facts on the ground. We may be further away from a genuine Palestinian state than we've ever been before. Today, or yesterday, I think, Emmanuel Macron said that we are 1 minute away from the window closing for a two-state solution. And we've heard, actually, this kind of commentary about 5 minutes to midnight or 1 minute to midnight for a number of years. When John Kerry launched his peace process in 2013 as Secretary of State of the U.S., he said to Congress, we have 18 to 24 months to be able to get a deal or the window's going to be entirely closed. At that time, there were 360,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. In 2016, the UN Security Council said in Resolution 2334 that the Israeli settlement enterprise was, and I'm quoting, dangerously imperiling the possibility of a two-state solution. At that time, there were 400,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. And now with this move at the United Nations, this diplomatic initiative, and with Macron's declaration, we are now at 525,000 Israeli settlers living illegally in the West Bank. It may well be that the two-state solution, as we've always envisioned it, is on life support, or we should be reading it last rites.
Now, that begs the question, can a Palestinian state be formed, or truly formed, that is, without Israel's agreement?
Yes and no. The creation of a Palestinian state is a right. It's not dependent upon the, I guess, permission of the illegally occupying power. But on the other hand, it's difficult to see how Israel's military and Israel's 750,000 settlers in both East Jerusalem and the West Bank will ever be dislodged unless there's a concerted effort economically and through weapons embargoes on Israel until it pays a price to recognize that peace consistent with international law is going to be a much more rewarding future for the two peoples who are living there. Neither the 7.5 million Israeli Jews nor the 7.5 million Palestinian Arabs living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River are going anywhere. And really the only basis for a prosperous future for both of them is a compassionate peace based on equality and human rights. Nothing else is going to work.
All right, that was Michael Lynk, former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Now, many Palestinians welcome the news, seeing it as a small step in the right direction. But the delegation meant to represent them at the UN General Assembly has been unable to travel due to restrictions from the US government. Foreign Minister Farzin Akbekian spoke to DW in Ramallah on the importance of state recognition.
This is the right time. It safeguards the two-state solution, and we expect several states to come forward. Now, changing things on the ground tomorrow, it will not change on the ground, but it sends a very clear message to Israel that your illusion on keeping an occupied land forever does not hold much water. And there is a state that is called the State of Palestine. It has its borders, it has its government, and it has its people.
So what does all this mean for the people in the Palestinian territories? In Hebron, one of the largest Palestinian cities in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, our correspondent Tania Krämer met a Palestinian human rights activist who has spent many years documenting the Israeli occupation and settlement expansion.
Issa Amro is a Palestinian human rights activist who lives in Hebron in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. To get home every day, he has to cross Israeli military checkpoints within the city.
I'm not allowed to go outside. I'm not allowed to go to
Today, he's briefly detained. The army says we have filmed at the checkpoint, which is not allowed, according to them. Issa is allowed to go, but only after we delete a clip. Even without our presence, this is part of his daily life.
I have to go to one checkpoint, two checkpoints, and sometimes 3 checkpoints to reach my house, and even to leave my house. This is the reality. Our life is so restricted. We are dehumanized.
With more Western countries now saying they will recognize the state of Palestine, how would things change here, if at all?
Recognizing Palestine as a state will prevent this soldier to do whatever he wants to me. And recognizing us as a human being and as a nation means the international community recognizing the Palestinian right for self-determination, for peace, for justice, for accountability. Because after recognition, we need accountability for the occupiers.
Hebron is often described as the microcosm of the conflict and the Israeli occupation. It was divided in the 1990s into two areas. H2, where Israeli settlers live inside the city, is solely under Israeli military control, and H1 under Palestinian civil control. Since October 7, however, all access to the city has been severely restricted by the Israeli military. Issa cannot freely move around his own city, like here on Shuhada Street, which is controlled by the Israeli army.
You live in a ghost town, not in a normal life.
Once the bustling city center, the Israeli military shut down its Palestinian-owned stores years ago. Settlers can drive here. Issa can only walk, but only up to a certain point.
So you can... We are not moving, we are not crossing. So as you know, I'm not allowed to continue more. I have less rights than other people. I have less rights than you in my own city, in my own streets, where I was born, where I was raised, where I used to play as a child here.
He hopes that recognition will provide a legal framework for change, but says recognition alone isn't enough.
After we get the recognition, we will ask them to intervene according to the international law mechanism to make peace here. So it's an obligation after they recognize us as a state here. And it's so important emotionally for us. We want to feel recognized. We want to feel that we exist, because here they say Palestinians never exist and never will.
In response to recognition, the Israeli government has repeated its threat to annex the occupied West Bank. But Issa says a de facto annexation is already happening in the West Bank. He shows us a brand new settler outpost guarded by the Israeli army right in a Palestinian neighborhood.
The Israeli government is creating more and more facts in the ground. As this new outpost, we have now tens of outposts and illegal settlements and military posts, military checkpoints, closure, settler violence. So the situation in the West Bank is really, escalating toward violence.
Without accountability, recognition may remain largely symbolic. However, for many people here, this is still a small but important step in the right direction.
Now let's talk about this with Natasha Hall. She's a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and joins us from Washington, D.C. today. Now, what do you make of the growing push to recognize Palestinian statehood? Is this mostly symbolic, as we've frequently heard, or does it carry real political weight?
Thank you for having me. I do think it is mostly symbolic. We're just seeing the facts on the ground, as your previous guests have noted, just get worse and worse for Palestinians, both in the West Bank and, of course, in Gaza, where this war continues. A war that the UN Human Rights Office has said is tantamount to genocide. And so if that's what we see on the ground, and we're seeing other states recognizing Palestine, that's a symbolic gesture, but we are not seeing any facts on the ground change. And that will not happen unless we see people putting their money where their mouth is. And that includes major companies that work in Israel. And of course, the United States, which has continued to allow Israel to conduct this war, to conduct settlement expansion, not just in the past 2 years, but for the past several decades.
Now, on the flip side, economic heavyweights like the US, Japan, and key EU countries like Germany and Italy have not joined the recognition wave. Does that make a difference?
I think it does make a difference. As I said, if Germany and the United States jumped on board in particular, this would signal a major shift. Now, it shouldn't be a very significant shift since all of these countries have said that they support a two-state solution. So it's unclear why it's controversial to recognize a Palestinian state if that's what if that's what your goal is in mind. But instead, we've seen backtracking on that, and of course, a Palestinian state becoming more and more impossible on the ground from settlement expansion, and of course, what we're seeing in Gaza today.
Now, these most recent recognitions, they are all linked to the end goal of a two-state solution. Is a significant majority of Palestinians still on board with a two-state solution?
Well, I think Palestinians have seen the reality change against a two-state solution for many years. They've been pushed in that direction by many mediators, by the United States, et cetera. But they really haven't seen their reality change for the better, quite the opposite. And that really happened after Oslo, when many Palestinians were kind of encouraged by a peace agreement. Others were more skeptical, and it turns out those that were more skeptical were right. And so I think it's really challenging today to see sort of an optimism for a two-state solution when you see the powers that be, especially the United States, talk about it, but not really push Israel towards that. And you see the Prime Minister and many other Israeli politicians saying there will be no Palestinian state.
Now, the UN Conference on Palestinian Statehood and the two-state solution in New York that continues today has gained broad international support, but can it really create political pressure when the US isn't backing it and can still veto any Security Council action?
So I think that this is the big problem. The United States has continued to be Israel's protector at the UN Security Council. This isn't new. Most of the US vetoes at the Security Council involve Israel. And so what we're having is a situation where the United States and Israel are increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. You mentioned the states that have not recognized a Palestinian state, but the vast majority, about 78% of the countries in the world have. And that is really going to signal a major shift, a major isolation, I think, especially from what's been termed as the global South, away from the United States and looking more towards U.S. adversaries like Russia and China. So I do suspect that the U.S. will continue to use its diplomatic cover and its power at the UN to shield Israel. But the reality is that the world is moving away from the UN and moving towards other kinds of blocs and alliances that would isolate the United States further.
Natasha Hall, there, Senior Fellow with the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.